All right, here we're looking at our really final learning targets, and we're wrapping up this whole first unit. So today we're really going to look at multiplying and dividing decimals. And when we're going through these, we're going to look at both just like the algorithm and the mathematical way to do it. We're also going to look at models and what they actually mean when we're looking at them. So here's where we're going to start with multiplying decimals. So go ahead and get this sheet all cut out, and we're going to fold it into different flaps, and kind of so we can kind of follow our steps along. So step one, so like we were doing with adding and subtracting decimals, things are a little different here, but we're still going to follow some steps. So step one, when I'm multiplying decimals, I line up my digits. The big thing here is the decimals may or may not line up. When I'm adding or subtracting, I have to make sure that my decimals are in line, but when I'm multiplying, that part doesn't really matter. So here you see I have 9.4 times 0.43. So 9 4/10 times 43 hundredths. Okay, we're going to really work on our terminology as well. So that's step one, is just line up my digits to the right side. That's the important part, to the right. Step two is I go ahead and I multiply. So I do 3 times 4 is 12, 3 times 9 is 27, plus 1 is 28. I have a placeholder, as I always do when I'm multiplying long digits, and I'll go ahead and put that placeholder in here for us. Okay, so then I multiply 4 times 4 is 16, carry the 1, 4 times 9 is 36, plus 1 is 37. So I've multiplied, but the next thing I really have to do before I'm totally done multiplying is I add up my different columns. So 2 plus 0 is 2, 8 plus 6 is 14, 2 plus 1 plus 7 is 0, and 4. Okay, so step number 3 is I count the decimal places in the problem, and I count the ones that are to the right of the decimal. So here in this top one I had 1, and in this bottom, the second one, I had 2, for a grand total of 3 decimal places. Okay, so from the right, we're just going to count. So I went over 1 place, and down here I went over 1, 2. So now step 4 for my final answer is I move my decimal to the left that number of places. So when I don't see a decimal in a problem, it's always just known that it's at the very end, it's after all of the numbers. So I take that, and since I had 3 decimal places right here, I have to move it 3 places as well for my final answer of 4.042. So now let's just think about, does this answer make sense? Right? We're not going to go back and double check everything, but we always want to say, do I make sense? So here I'm starting with something that's a little bit more than 9. This, I'm multiplying it by almost half, right? Because 0.5 would be exactly half, so they need to be about, my final answer needs to be about half as much or a little less than half of what I started with. Well, that's what I ended up with. So yes, my answer makes sense. So I can go ahead and count that as use that as my final answer. So we're going to fold this up. So now let's look at what it actually means to multiply decimals. Like, what is it actually, what are we doing? So we're multiplying a decimal by a decimal here. So here I have 4/10, and I'm going to go ahead and color that in blue. And here, yes, color matters for this one. Okay, so I'm multiplying that 4/10 times my 3/10, and that 3/10 is going to be yellow. And you see I've got these going in different directions. One's going up and down, and one's going across. That also matters. So when I combine these two and I actually multiply them together, right, just like I find the area of anything, I end up with 12 1/100ths. So if you can see, I still have my 4/10 colored in blue, and I have my 3/10 colored in yellow. The thing that overlaps is here in green, because blue and yellow is green, and that ends up being 12 1/100ths. And I know it's the 100ths because it's the little teeny boxes. It's not an entire strip. So that's really what it's looking at, and why our number kind of gets smaller if we're multiplying a decimal times a decimal. So now let's look at multiplying a decimal by a whole number. And here you just need different colors. They don't have to be the same colors that I have. So here I have 0.34 times 5. So my decimal times my whole number. The decimal tells us what I have, so what is shaded, and this whole number tells me how many times I shade it that way. So here I've got purple. I've got 34 hundredths colored in purple. Then I have 34 hundredths colored in blue. Then I have 34 hundredths colored in pink. And then I have 34 hundredths colored in green. And then I have 34 hundredths colored in orange. That's 5 different times, 5 different groupings of this 34 hundredths. And the total that is shaded is 1.70. So you can go in and count exactly how many are there, or just kind of look at the picture. So I want you to go through in your notebook and go ahead and do this and use these same numbers for your examples. You don't have to use the same colors, but make sure you understand, what am I actually doing here? And now we're going to look at dividing decimals. Okay, so you should have this little book go ahead and cut out the pieces, and when you fold them over, you'll see the different steps. I put just one little staple in mine so then it can fold up as a book as I'm looking through it. Okay, so now step 1. So step 1 is I move the decimal in the divisor, right? And I gave us little stars to help us understand where these things are at. So make sure that you mark that as well so you know exactly where we're looking at. So I move the decimal in the divisor to the right until this divisor is a whole number. So here's our example. We've got 0.64 or 64 hundredths divided by 4 tenths. So that divided by that goes out in the divisor, and here's what we left. So I have to move this decimal over one place until this is a whole number. Okay, so now step 2. So now I move the decimal in the dividend, so inside, right, that's why my star is here, the inside, the same number of places in step 1. Well, since I moved it one place in step 1, I move it one place in step 2. So here's what I'm looking at now. So step 3 is I go ahead and I divide. So 4 goes into 6 one time. 1 times 4 is 4. So then I subtract. 6 minus 4 gives me 2, and I bring down this 4. 4 goes into 24 6 times. 6 times 4 is 24, and I subtract, and I end up with 0. The very final step is I move my decimal straight up. And you can really do these two in either order. That's why they're kind of on the same step. I generally like to move my decimal up first and then divide, but sometimes when we're looking at numbers, it's easier to divide first and then deal with your decimal, so it really doesn't matter. Okay, so once I move that decimal straight up, I end up with that 1.6 as my final answer. So now here's where I want you to kind of test what we've just done. So I want you to find the quotient here, and quotient is our word that tells us we're going to be dividing. So go ahead and divide 55 and 318 thousandths by 3 and 4 tenths. Go ahead and use this piece of paper to work, and I'm going to check on these, so make sure that you're going through this. But now that we've seen the algorithm, just the math, what do we do? Why do we do that? So let's look at these models here. Okay, so we're going to be dividing decimals with models. And what we're really looking at here, we're going to be looking at 1.6 divided by 4. So the first thing is I'm going to have to shade in. Here's what I start, my 1.6. So we're going to shade in 1 and 6 tenths. So there's 1 tenth, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tenths. So that's what that's what tells us is how much is shaded. That's what this first number tells us. And I'm going to make a little arrow. So how much is shaded? This second number is where it really comes into play, and I'm going to use a different number. Since this is less than 1, that's where we're kind of paying attention here. This tells us the how much is in each bucket, kind of a question. Is how I like to think about it. That tells us how much is in each bucket, and that's because it's less than 1. So this tells me I have 4 tenths, so I have to circle groups of 4 tenths. So there's one group of 4 tenths. There's another group of 4 tenths. Here's another group of 4 tenths. And here's another group of 4 tenths. So my final answer for this one would be it equals 4. I have 4 groups of 4 tenths in a total of 1.6. Okay, so now let's look at this second example. So this 2.6 divided by 2. So again, this first number is going to go here, is how much is shaded. So I'm going to go ahead and shade these. So there's 1, there's 2, and then I've got 6 tenths. Okay, so we're going to shade this. So here's the only real difference. This number you see is greater than 1. So that tells us how many buckets we have. Okay, to put things into. So now I can look at my pictures and say, oh, well, if I know I have 2 buckets, half of this has to go in each bucket. So if I have 26 total tenths, then I know that 13 of them go into one bucket because that's cut in half. So there's 10, 11, 12, 13. So there's one bucket and there's 2 buckets. So here I would have 2 buckets, but what's inside my final answer is 1.3. That's my final answer. So my final answer down here tells me how many are in each bucket, whereas my final answer when I was dividing by that decimal told me how many buckets I have. So this is just an interesting kind of way to keep in mind of what are we actually doing when we're following that algorithm, and why do we do it, right? It's not useful just to be able to do the math. We have to kind of know why it works. So now you have some pictures that you can refer back to. So now really you're going to be spending some time doing your con work and also working on your packets for these last couple sections of our unit. Make sure that you feel pretty comfortable here because we are done with this first unit and we're getting ready to take our test. So come in and find me or email me whenever you get stuck.